Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the ARPA Institute panel discussion. First of all, I would like to say a few words about the activities of the ARPA Institute in Armenia, and then we'll introduce the speakers, the moderator first, and then the speakers will be introduced by the moderator, Professor Aprahamian. I am Hagop Panosyan, the representative of ARPA Institute, and ARPA Institute has been working in Armenia mainly since 1992. We have, throughout the years, worked on various areas in science, technology, engineering, engineering, and healthcare and other areas. And our main goal is to advance these different areas. ARPA members are experts in various fields, and we provide consultations, advice, and also organize projects in Armenia, and we implement projects. Our latest activities include a new clean room, the first clean room, class 1000 clean room in Armenia, which was actually initiated by Professor Aprahamian herself. And ARPA Institute is implementing it and still working on improving and advancing it more with more instrumentation and capabilities. This is now in the Areg National Lab, which is one of the main labs in Armenia. And also, we have our annual invention competition, which is for young scientists. We've been doing that for about 18 years. And any young scientist, 35 years or younger, can participate. And there's no limit as to the subject, but also, of course, graduate students can submit their inventions. And then these inventions will be evaluated by experts, and we will decide on the best, and we'll give an award. Our award this year is $10,000. And also now we have, we are going to establish, we're actually working on it, a center of excellence for circuit design in the Polytechnic University. And the main objective will be to teach advanced circuit design. And the software that they will be working on is the Cadence, International Cadence software, which is used by most circuit designers. And this will, of course, we're hoping, attract the attention of large companies like NVIDIA and AMD and others. And it's not only going to teach regular circuit design courses, but we are expecting even advanced research related to circuit design. Now, also, we have two new projects that we're working on, and it's being directed by distinguished Professor Ara Apkarian from UC Irvine. One of them is a research project in the Yerevan State University, and there are 5 young scientists that are doing the research. The subject is confined light. When you confine light to a very small area, apparently it behaves, it affects material in very different ways. And simultaneously, we are doing the experimental side of this project in the Areg National Lab, and we already have some preliminary results. The main objective is to work on silicon solar cells, but then with a new approach. The solar cell now will include, at the most, 100 micron thickness of silicon, and then the light will be confined on small areas on the silicon, and then the results show that the efficiency of absorption goes up to close to 50%, which is quite quite different and quite advanced compared to the regular on-market solar cells. And this, of course, then can make it competitive with petroleum. So we are trying to advance this technology so that even solar cells can be manufactured in Armenia. We, of course, also have other areas that we're working on. We help the universities by providing guidance, advice, and also instrumentation. Also the institutes, we work with many institutes in Ashtarak, in Yerevan, and other areas. And also we work with the government of Armenia, especially in the area of science fairs. We have introduced the concept of science fairs for school children in Armenia in 2017. And for the last 3 years, the government has adopted this program, and they are already organizing all over Armenia science fairs in schools. And they hold a general science fair in Yerevan, the winners of which go to the International Science and Engineering Fair in the United States. And this year it's being held in Los Angeles, and I'll be a judge actually in that area. So these are the kinds of activities that ARPA works on. And of course, I don't want to go with all the activities that we have in there, but this is a summary of what. And we would, of course, encourage the viewers, if you can, and if you would like, to contribute to the ARPA Institute so that we can continue our activities. We would appreciate it very much. And right now, I would like to introduce Professor Ania Aprahamian, who will then introduce the speakers, the panelists. Professor Ania Aprahamian is a Freeman Chair of Physics and Astronomy and a concurrent professor of chemistry and biochemistry at the University of Notre Dame. Her research spans explosive nuclear astrophysics, fission, nuclear structure, and applications of nuclear science to medicine, energy, fission, and stockpile stewardship. Dr. Aprahamian has published over 235 articles in refereed journals and presented over 285 invited addresses. She's a member of the Council of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Armenia on science and technology issues and was the director of the Areg National Science Lab in Armenia, the program director of nuclear physics and nuclear astrophysics at the U.S. National Science Foundation, chair of the physics department, and the director of the nuclear science lab at the University of Notre Dame. Ani has co-chaired 2 National Research Council committees, the Science of the Electron-Ion Collider and the Decadal Survey of Nuclear Physics, the Heart of Matter. She also was a part of the preparation of the recent 2023 U.S. Long-Range Plan for Nuclear Physics, mapping out priorities for nuclear science in the USA for the next 10 years. Ani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hagop, for that laudatory introduction. Today, I would like to thank all of you who've joined us. We're going to talk about nuclear energy, specifically at Metsamor, and new and advanced technologies in nuclear energy. Climate change, or I should say accelerating climate change, has compelled the global community to embrace nuclear energy again. And I would say, ironically, nuclear energy is both the lowest CO2 emitting source of energy, as well as the least source of radioactive contamination of the environment in comparison, for example, with coal or natural gas or other things. Renewables have more than doubled worldwide. I am presently in Germany, and the countryside is covered with solar panel farms and wind farms. Unfortunately, there is just no way that these renewables will rise to meet the demands of a technologically advanced society of any kind. In Armenia, 30% of the electricity is produced by Metsamor. And some of you may just recall historically that when Armenia became independent shortly after the earthquake, that there were attempts to shut down the nuclear power plants, both of them. There were two at the time. And it was discovered very quickly that we didn't have any other reliable sources of energy. Natural gas from Georgia failed to arrive safely in Armenia over many attempts. But today we have a panel of experts that are going to discuss both the present, the past, and the future of nuclear energy. We decided in the past as a country that we should shut down one of the power plants, and Metsamor has been updated and made safe, and we'll hear about that from our experts. So the plan for today is that Professor Areg Danagoulian, who is at MIT in nuclear science and engineering, will give an introduction to the nuclear energy situation. He was the author of a recent article about how nuclear power saved Armenia. It appeared in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The other expert we have is Dr. Bob Budnitz. Bob was a staff scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He is now emeritus, but more than anything else, he's an expert on safety, both in nuclear reactor safety and nuclear waste safety. And he has served on the president of Armenia's Nuclear Energy Safety Council, which has met in Yerevan from 1997 to 2017. And I understand that the new council is now being reinstituted, so he's an expert on the safety issues, and he'll be telling us about that. Our third expert is Professor Koroush Shirvan, also from Nuclear Science and Engineering at MIT. Koroush is an expert on basically fail-safe or accident-tolerant fuels for alternative reactor designs, and he's also a part of a team to educate executives of energy companies with regards to what's possible in the future. So let's not waste any time, and I will ask all of the participants to please mute your participation for now. And let's start with hearing Dr. Danagoulian at first, and please do put questions into the chat. Areg?
Thank you, Annie, for the introduction. Okay, you should all be able to see my slides. So I'll go kind of quickly because I want to leave enough time for both Bob and for Koroush to talk about the both the history of our nuclear power in Armenia, as well as the what's going on in the world. I'll primarily focus on the basics of physics, engineering, as well as some history of nuclear, and finally the economics of nuclear, which actually Koroush is a great expert in. And the reason I chose to kind of focus a bit on economics is because many people tend to ignore the economic aspect of nuclear, which is actually critical. So what's the history of nuclear fission? This is nuclear fission is actually a process by which you break up nuclei of uranium and plutonium in a way as a way of extracting energy out of it, typical thermal energy. I'm comparing here two reactions. One of them is the burning process of methane. Okay, So when you burn a molecule of methane, okay, with oxygen, you get about 8 electron volts of energy. Ignore electron volts, it's a unit of energy. So 8 units of energy. However, when you break up a nucleus of uranium-235, you get about 100 million electron volts of energy. So every reaction, every breakup of uranium nucleus produces about 10 million times more energy than the burning of every molecule of methane. Okay, so this is what we call about. This is what we refer to when we talk about uranium having high energy density. That small amount of uranium can produce a lot of energy. Okay, typically you load up your reactor with about 150 tons of uranium. Volumetrically, this is a very small volume. Okay, this is about 7 cubic meters of material, maybe less, maybe more, but 10 cubic meters of material. And that gives you 2 years of burn time. You can produce energy for 2 years without any need of refueling. Okay. And from strategic point of view, this high energy density translates to higher energy independence. Because once you get the fuel, you have 2 years for 2 years, you have essentially guaranteed flow of energy. So, but what is fission? Okay, we use this term fission. Fission in English means process of breaking things apart. Okay, opposite of fusion, where you're fusing things together. And if you have a nucleus of uranium-235, sometimes it may spontaneously undergo fission. It may undergo a breakup, but most of the time you trigger that by shooting a neutron at it. Neutron is a subatomic particle. Nuclei are made of protons and neutrons. So if a neutron comes from somewhere and hits a uranium-235, with some chance, it will get absorbed by uranium-235, destabilize it, and cause the uranium nucleus to break up into 2 smaller nuclei, which can be of different size and shape and things like that. However, the important thing is that this breakup process releases 2 to 3 more neutrons, and these 2 to 3 more neutrons go and hit other uranium nuclei in the material. So you have like a bulk of material with uranium, and they trigger more fissions, and those ones produce more neutrons. So they go trigger more, more fission events. Think of this as essentially like a viral spread. You have a person that coughs, emits a bunch of virions, it infects other people, they cough, they emit virions, and then they infect the next person, and you have more people infected. Okay, so it's actually quite similar to viral spread. So imagine you have a chunk of uranium, you shoot a neutron at it, you get a fission, but in most situations, if you just take a piece of uranium and you shoot neutrons at it, okay, you're not going to get this self-sustained reaction. What's going to happen is that there will be a fission event. They'll get a bunch of neutrons, but most of the neutrons will escape. They will not trigger secondary fission because it's a probabilistic process. It's not guaranteed that they will trigger secondary fission events. Okay, so you cannot achieve a sustained fission chain reaction. Again, similar to viral spread, people are far apart. The virus dies out very, very quickly. The mathematics of the basics of fission is actually quite similar to the it's quite similar to again to the basic math of the viral spread. This is number of the fissions, versus time. This is your time. This is the characteristic time, and K is basically a multiplication coefficient. We refer to it as K effective. It's very similar to the R0 coefficient in epidemic studies. And if you are running a reactor, you want this reaction rate to be about the same. So you want the K to be approximately 1. And engineering a reactor in a way where K is approximately 1 is not an easy matter. And that's where reactor engineers come in. Okay, so let's continue. So depending what the value of your K is, you might, if K is less than 1, then this term over here becomes negative and you have an exponential decay. So you end up having an assembly which we refer to as subcritical. The reaction dies out. The chain, you trigger a chain, you trigger a fission, it may trigger a second fission, but then after that it dies out. It's called subcritical. If you drive K above 1, you can have a supercritical event. Okay, and that generally for a reactor is terrible. Okay, this is actually how the principle of how a nuclear explosion happens. Nuclear bomb works. That doesn't mean that the reactors can explode, but they can have power excursions. Like Chernobyl was this. This is what happened in Chernobyl. Okay. Ideally, we want K as equal to 1, so the exponent is 0. So you end up having a constant, power power output. And nuclear reactors have been designed such that K is approximately 1 most of the time, and you have this kind of a behavior. Okay. Okay. So I mentioned that if you have just one piece of uranium, nothing will happen because the neutrons will escape. You will not have a sustained chain reaction. But if you stack a bunch of uranium next to each other, well, those neutrons will be absorbed by a second fuel element. So these are fuel elements. Like this is uranium, this is uranium, this is uranium. Actually, most reactors are uranium oxide, but whatever. So then if you do things just right, you can have a sustained reaction that will constantly result in fission and constantly burn uranium. Okay. When this happens, the uranium gets pretty hot because you are releasing lots of energy. Okay. The kinetic energy of those fission fragments of these daughter products get translated to the material. The material gets very hot. So you need to cool it. And you do that by pumping cold water. The cold water comes in, comes out hot. Okay. And this cooling is critical for the safety of the nuclear reactor. You know, there's something called loss of coolant accidents. And a lot of these design effort in the reactor goes to ensure that the reactor is cooled at all times, that the cooling system is extremely reliable. Okay. 2 major disasters have caused in part due to failure of cooling, maybe 3 actually. And modern designs are used something called passive cooling, where the thing will cool itself even if all the pumps fail. Okay. There's different ways of cooling the core, by the way. Water is one way to do it. You can also cool it with gas or with liquid metals or with molten salts even. So there's many different ways of doing this. And every way has its own advantages and disadvantages. What happens is that you take this hot water, you turn it into steam at some point, and then use that steam to drive a turbine, steam turbine. And then that steam turbine is coupled to a generator, just like the alternators in your cars. There's big generators that then make electricity. So they convert the thermal energy into electric energy. Okay. Well, what happens if, remember, I was saying that we need to keep that K equal to 1. We cannot allow it to go above 1, otherwise bad things will happen. So how do we control that? It's typically controlled by using things called control rods. Okay, these are basically neutron poisons. They kill neutrons. And when they kill neutrons, there's no more neutrons going through, and this K effective drops below 1. This viral spread stops, and that shuts down the reactor. Okay. There's obviously more nuance to this. This is a very cartoonish way of seeing how a reactor works, but at a very high level, this is roughly how things work in a basic reactor. Okay, so what does a nuclear reactor look like? And what's the history of reactors? Where do reactors come from? Okay. First reactor was built by Enrico Fermi, the Nobel Prize laureate, who did work in basically almost every field of physics and even mathematics. It was built in 1942 in University of Chicago in squash courts underground, like in sports where people used to play squash. Okay, it was a research facility. The goal was essentially to show that you can build a reactor. It's referred to as a graphite pile. It was a Chicago pile number 1. It was a pile of graphite, literally. Graphite was used to moderate the neutrons, to slow them down, to increase the probability of them being captured by uranium. Okay. This essentially allowed to have the first sustained chain reaction. Chain reactions had been discovered in the 30s also by Fermi and others, but this was the first sustained chain reaction that could go on for days at a time, okay, and not just for an instant, okay. So graphite reactors, as we now know, and people knew it at the time very well too, are prone to accidents. So this reactor had an emergency shutdown. This may be an apocryphal story. I don't know if this is true or not, but they say that the expression scram stood for safety control rod axe man. And that there used to be control rods, and there was a guy with an axe standing next to a monitor that was measuring the activity in the reactor. And if you were to go above a line that Enrico Fermi drew in red with a pencil, you were supposed to chop a wire, like a rope that was holding a control rod for the control rods to immediately go inside. Okay. The equivalent of a scram is the AZ5 button that you might remember from Chernobyl HBO miniseries. Okay. Fermi and everyone knew that graphite reactors are risky. They knew it very well. Okay. The Soviets learned it the hard way on April 26, 1986. Okay. I mean, they knew it before that too, but the operators didn't know it. So the first graphite reactors were created primarily as science instruments. Their immediate application was not energy. the nuclear reactors were started being used for energy quite late. The first use was actually, even before naval propulsion, was for synthesizing plutonium for nuclear weapons. Okay, and primarily in Oak Ridge during the Manhattan Project, as well as Pacific Northwest National Lab, they built a bunch of graphite piles, so these graphite reactors, with the only purpose of taking uranium and converting it into plutonium, and then harvesting plutonium for nuclear weapons, for nuclear bombs. But they immediately discovered that this thing is producing lots of heat, and that heat can be used. And the first application was actually for naval propulsion. This is a picture of USS Nautilus. You know, the keel was laid it was actually put to sea in 1954. And this is the first submarine that used nuclear reactors for propulsion. That steam that was used, I mentioned about, goes and drives a steam turbine, and turbine drives the screw, the propeller of the submarine, and that allows the submarine to stay underwater for a very long amount of time. Okay, modern subs can go 20 years without refueling. Okay, essentially compared to diesel submarines that have very short amount of time, and they're extremely limited how fast they can go underwater. They cannot stay underwater for a very long time. These guys can stay for months underwater. You know, submariners, they do not see the sun for months at a time. But this is a lot. This is thanks to nuclear reactors that they use for propulsion. Okay. This is a picture of a modern submarine. This is the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. This is the cruise missile version of it, and you can see a 300 megawatt thermal reactor in the very back. All U.S. submarines and most of Russian submarines, as well as all U.S. aircraft carriers, use nuclear power for propulsion. Okay, in the United States, the main user, essentially, the biggest user of nuclear power is the Navy. Okay, so eventually people sort of came about and said, well, if you can put a nuclear reactor in a submarine, we can also put it on dry soil, and we can hook up a generator, electric generator, to it. We can start making electricity. And that became the civilian power program, the nuclear power program. And this is a list of all the reactors that exist in the world currently. Okay, there's a total of 436 as of whenever I got this screenshot from. The number is increasing, okay? And the main reactor, so what you see is that the reactor type, countries that are using this, numbers, the power, fuel, coolant, and moderator. The one that interests you is primarily the type of the reactor. So two types of reactors are by far the majority, okay? It's pressurized water reactors and boiling water reactors. Okay, so Metsamor is a pressurized water reactor, and it's of a type that's the most common in the world. About 60% of the reactors, 60-70% of the reactors are pressurized PWR, pressurized water reactors. Okay, the next most popular one is boiling water reactors, and then there's also pressurized heavy water reactors. Okay, that Canada and India, the so-called can-do reactors. Notice that there's a light water graphite reactors. Russia is the only one operating it. This is the Areg reactor, again featured in Chernobyl mini series. And there's a reason why there's only 11, because it's a very risky reactor. How does a pressurized water reactor work? Okay, so I drew earlier this picture where we had essentially uranium rods and there was water cooling it. Things are a lot more complicated than this. This is an animation I got from Wikipedia. Basically, in a pressurized water reactor, the fuel gets so hot that if you want to really remove all that heat, you cannot use water at 100 Celsius, like in a tea kettle. You need higher temperature, 200, 250 Celsius. And the way you achieve that, you take that water and you pressurize it, like in a pressure cooker. And that allows the water boiling temperature to go up to hundreds of Celsius. So the pressurized water reactors, they apply pressure to achieve higher temperature. That increases the efficiency of the plant. Okay, so you have a primary loop where you essentially use it to remove heat, a secondary loop where now you are actually making steam. You take the water in the secondary loop at a lower pressure and you get it to boil.
Areg, John, your screen disappeared. It's not showing.
Is it not showing? How about now? Is it showing?
Yes, we're good now.
So maybe something with, so now is it still showing or is it disappears too?
It's showing.
Okay, it's probably the animation doing something. So yeah, you drive a turbine, and a turbine drives a generator, and that sends electricity to Yerevan. And then this typically when you see these big towers, this is actually a picture from Metsamor. They are primarily the part of the third
Areg,
group.
I think it's the animations that are making it go
Okay,
black.
okay.
You may want to proceed ahead.
Okay. But long story short, pressurized water reactors use high pressure, high temperature. They have higher kernel efficiency. I mean, it works out to be about 35% and also higher cost. So whenever you have a large pressurized vessel, that's lots of steel at extremely high quality, and that's going to cost a lot of money. Another alternative is boiling water reactors. I'll talk only very briefly. They are similar to pressurized water reactors, except the pressure is lower, and the water boils inside the reactor itself. Okay, so that allows the simplification of the plant. I mean, it allows you to skip one loop, and it also, because it's lower pressure, the requirements on steel are not the same ones. There are lower requirements. It makes for a cheaper plant, but also a less efficient one. So there's kind of costs and benefits to boiling water reactors. These days, there are some boiling water reactors under construction. There's one in Darlington, Canada, but most reactors in this day and age are primarily pressurized water reactors for civilian purposes, at least. So as I said, lower efficiency, a bit more complex internals, a bit harder to operate. Okay. All right, this is another way of seeing what's the phase space of different type of reactors that exist in this day and age. We can split reactors in two ways, by fast neutron reactors and thermal neutron reactors. And the way you produce thermal neutrons is by using light water moderated and heavy water moderated and graphite moderated. Three different ways, okay? And so far I've already talked about two of these, light water and graphite. 90% of energy is produced by light water moderated water reactors. Those could be boiling water reactors or pressurized water reactors, okay? This one is the Arbenke, okay? So Russia is the only one, as I mentioned, that operates. Arbenke stands for Reactor Большой мощности Panelists, okay? It's a very cheap reactor. I think per unit energy or per unit power, it's 4 times cheaper than pressurized water reactors. So the Soviets did build these reactors for a reason, because they were so cheap to build, okay? But they are also very dangerous, as we found out, okay? And there's still 11 being operated in Russia as we speak. They have been modified to be less dangerous, but they are dangerous nevertheless. So the Metsamor reactor is one of these pressurized water reactors. It's a much safer. It's not as safe as Western reactors, let's be clear, but it's definitely much safer than the graphite type of reactors that was operated in Chernobyl. People ask this question a lot, right? Because they think Metsamor was a Soviet reactor, Chernobyl was a Soviet reactor. They think it's the same, but they are not the same. They are very different. Okay, so far, so good. We talked about physics, we talked about engineering, we talked about history. Now I want to talk about economics. And the reason I want to talk about economics is I want you to ask yourself the question, if nuclear reactors are so awesome, how come everyone is not using it? How come we don't have 100% nuclear power all over the country? In fact, some countries like France have 80% energy produced by nuclear, while America has 20%. So why is one country producing 80% level and the other one producing 20% level? How come they're all not 100% or 80%, whatever? There's many other factors that most of the time we do not discuss, but honestly are even much more important than technological or engineering challenges. As scientists and engineers, we tend to focus on science and engineering, okay, because that's what we love and cherish. But the actual issues keeping back nuclear are also economical. So in this plot, what I'm showing you is the total nuclear power production per year, starting from 1970 all the way to 2022. Okay, this is in terawatt hours. And you can see that there was this increase in nuclear power production, which sort of saturated in 2009. And then there was a drop-off after the Fukushima accident. Notice that the 3 Mile Island accident, which most of you know, happened in 1979, that didn't stop the increase of the nuclear power production. Even after Chernobyl, there was a continued increase in nuclear power production, okay? It's true that many reactor projects were canceled. It's true that the rate at which reactors were being built was diminished. However, energy output of nuclear reactors increased after that. And then something happened in 2000. This is quite counterintuitive because we tend to tell ourselves that the reason the world doesn't want nuclear reactors is entirely because of Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island. But this plot is sort of not contradicting this, but definitely telling us that there's something else going on. because clearly there was an increased demand for nuclear power, even after Chernobyl, which was a massive disaster. So what happened in 2000s that sort of changed the outcome? Okay, for those of you who have ever worked with oil or gas or know anything about energy markets, you know what happened in 2000s. It was the invention of hydrofracking, which stands for hydrofracturing, which allowed access to vast volumes of natural gas in shale layers, deep geological layers, about 1 kilometer deep, that in the past were inaccessible due to a variety of reasons. And this new way of drilling and extraction flooded markets with cheap and available natural gas. In the United States, the price of natural gas dropped by a factor of 4. It dropped by 75%. Natural gas was all over the place. Electricity became cheap. And natural gas started to really compete with nuclear power. And nuclear power's economic viability and economic attractiveness, business attractiveness, diminished. And that's primarily one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons, not the only reason, why suddenly interest in nuclear started to diminish. And then came Fukushima, and the Japanese shut down their nuclear reactors, and this drop is a reflection of that, and there is an increase after. So the takeaway from this is that it was also economics. We tend to forget about economics all the time to our own peril, okay? But economics and business decisions ultimately what drive the final decision to either build a nuclear power plant, a natural gas fire plant, a coal plant, or a solar panel. Okay? That's what ultimately drives decision. Okay. So definitely public fears of nuclear disasters contributed to what nuclear fears. But again, that's not the only reason. Okay. Economics played an important role. Cheap and abundant natural gas in the United States primarily. Nuclear stayed expensive. But something else that I want to talk a little bit about, and I hope not to take too much time, is the deregulation of energy markets, which sort of hit nuclear in a kind of negative way. Deregulation of energy markets meant that the electricity prices became variable and unpredictable. Okay, so as far as nuclear plants are concerned, now you have large capital costs. Okay, building a nuclear plant is not cheap; they're expensive, very expensive, and unknown future prices of electricity. Basically, this is your costs, and this is your revenues. Your costs are large, your revenues is uncertain, and this results in a high-risk business, which then pushed many utility companies all over the world not to go for nuclear. Okay. What is deregulation? The reason I decided to talk about deregulation is not only because it's kind of interesting topic, but also because Armenia is currently deregulating its energy market, its electricity market. So for those from Armenia, this might be an interesting thing to look into and understanding what deregulation of electricity market is. In a regulated market, okay, electricity, okay, prices are determined years in advance. There's negotiations, prices fixed. There may be a daytime rate, nighttime rate, but those prices are fixed for years, okay? So electricity producers can plan ahead. They know for years in advance what they're going to get paid for every kilowatt hour that they deliver to the grid, okay? This translates to nearly fixed income because you know how much electricity is being used, you know how much it's going to cost, how much you can charge for it, so you know what your income is, okay? So this is very good for generators with large capital costs for nuclear because at least they know, okay, we spent, I don't know, $5 billion on the reactor. Well, what's going to be our revenue afterwards? So they can plan ahead. In a deregulated market, prices are determined 24 hours in advance for 5-minute windows via auctions. You don't know the price until 24 hours before you deliver the energy, okay? Prices can change rapidly, highly inelastic, because the energy is highly inelastic commodity. There's no guaranteed return. High risk for anyone with large capital costs. It's difficult for nuclear, also very difficult for solar and wind, but it's good for society. It means more competition, lower prices, a more responsive grid. Now, I want to put some qualifiers. It's good when it's done correctly. When it's not done correctly, it actually ends up in bad outcomes. In Texas, a couple of years ago in Texas, there were some very bad outcomes, in part because of poorly done deregulation. This is an example of what electricity prices were in New England, where I live, okay? On June 8th in 2023, there's an online site, which is really cool, iso-ne.com, ISO Express. You can go there and you can see all the historic prices. You can see the price in real time. It's a rabbit hole. I can spend lots of time. But this shows the price over 24 hours, okay? And you see that the price starts at $24 per megawatt hour, and then it peaks at $60 or $55 at like in the afternoon. You see increases in price in the morning and in the evening. And anyone who has worked with energy knows why, because that's where the demand is high. High demand, high cost, high price, right? We know that. But there is more to this. Sometimes the price in the deregulated market can go negative. This is the data from February 20th. The price was $20 per megawatt hour, and then it went to minus $150 per megawatt hour. How is it possible to have a negative price on electricity? The answer is by looking at how are these prices determined? They are determined by forecasting. So many of these utilities, as well as the regulating agency, there is this regulating body that does the auctioning, they do forecasting. They can guess how much demand there is going to be. This is a plot from the same day for the forecast and for the actual, what actually happened. Forecast is what they thought would happen. And you see there's a discrepancy here. Most of the time, they can predict things down to like a few percent, but sometimes things go wrong. You know, sometimes there's something unexpected. Weather has not been forecast correctly that affects this thing. And this translates to this discrepancy. This discrepancy means that there is a glut abundance because they were planning this, but this is what they got. There was an enormous amount of extra energy, and the operators cannot shut down their plants easily. Okay, so what they do is that they incentivize the users to turn on their lights, to use as much of electricity. It's cheaper for them to pay you to turn on your electricity, to turn on your lights, rather than for them to shut down the plant. And that's what makes the price negative. Negative means that they are paying you to use electricity. Okay, not the other way around. Okay, and this typically happens in the afternoons because that's when we typically have reduced use of electricity. So it's important if you have a nuclear power plant, you want that plant to be a load follower. This is another example where prices again went negative. This is from February 8th. Again, last in February, this keeps happening. Forecast, actual, and you can see that when there was this big disagreement between actual and forecast, that again drove the prices negative. Okay. Something else that you see in plot is that the peak demand is typically in the morning around 8 a.m. and in the evening around 6 p.m. Okay, so when people wake up, they turn everything, the demand goes up, and they can come home, they turn everything on again, and it drops down. Okay, let me ask you the following question. Okay, and because there was this mismatch over here, that's what drove the prices. That's what drove the prices negative. Guess where is solar on this plot? Okay, there's lots of, I don't want to say hype, but less of excitement about solar panels. Solar panels are becoming cheaper and cheaper. We're going to start putting solar panels everywhere. Well, where is solar on this plot? Solar is right around them. Okay, so solar, one of the difficulties with solar energy is produced at a time when we need energy the least. Okay, sometimes when solar really comes online is when the prices go negative. So if the price is negative, what should be the cost of your solar panel for it to be profitable? The answer is it has to be even more negative, okay, which is outlandish. Okay, this is, I mean, prices of oil are not always negative. These are a bit extreme cases that I have found, but prices are low at the time when solar is produced, and that makes solar not very profitable. Second question, where is wind? Wind is typically at midnight. Wind kicks up typically at midnight. Anyone who is in Yerevan knows that in summer days, 11 p.m., midnight is when the wind really kicks up, right? Again, energy usage at midnight is fairly low, okay? So that makes wind and solar not very profitable because they are energies increase the time when we need it the least, okay? All right, I will talk very briefly about levelized cost of electricity. So, okay, now you are thinking about building a nuclear power plant or natural gas-fired plant. Okay, there's different alternatives, coal or something like that. How do you make the business financial decision? One way to determine the cost of electricity, you want to ask yourself, you know, what's the cost of electricity produced by this energy source or that energy? So how do we determine the cost of electricity? If your maintenance costs, capital costs are extremely variable, like in nuclear energy, you produce you spend lots of money on building nuclear power plant, then energy is relatively cheap because uranium is cheap. In natural gas, it's the other way around. Building the plant is not as expensive, but natural gas is quite expensive. Okay. So how do we determine the overall cost of electricity? And the way that's determined is where there's this parameter called levelized cost of electricity. Okay, that's average cost of producing 1 megawatt hour of electricity throughout the life of the generator. And the way you determine it, you take all the costs over the lifetime of the generator, of the plant, for 40, 60 years, all the money you spent on it, and you divide it by sum of all electricity produced by the plant. Okay, and this is like the one figure of merit that you can use to do apple-to-apple comparisons between two different plants. There is a semi-complicated formula over here that takes your investment expenditures, your operations and maintenance costs, your fuel expenditures. It takes the discount rate. Okay, it's basically the interest that you have to pay or that can be paid to you if you were to put this money somewhere else, and the expected and the electricity generated in the year T. Okay, this formula in some cases can be simplified to two parts: capital costs per energy and fuel costs per energy. Okay, these are some approximations. So if we look at these two things, okay, basically this is capital costs and fuel costs. Okay, so if you don't want to look into the math, just think about this. Levelized cost of electricity effectively are levelized capital costs and levelized fuel costs. That's what you are really interested in. These are the two parameters with which you can compare different plants with each other. So the capital costs tend to be high for nuclear and they are low for gas. Okay, fuel costs, on the other hand, are low for nuclear and high for gas, higher for gas than for uranium. As I said, for uranium, the uranium is not cheap, but you buy it only once every 2 years. Natural gas, you're buying it every day, right? So it ends up being actually more expensive. We'll see the actual numbers later, right? So what this means is that if your energy mix has gas and nuclear, so think in Armenia, Harazdan, that's the Harazdan natural gas fired plant, which is, I believe, 1.5 gigawatts, and Metsamor, which is about 400 megawatts, then what the optimal way, the way to really make the most profit and spend the least amount of money is you run your nuclear at the maximum power because the fuel is cheap. So Metsamor's capacity factor is about 90%. So Metsamor is producing 90% of the energy that it can theoretically produce. And then use gas to make up for the difference. Why? Because fuel is expensive. You want to burn just as much gas as you truly is necessary past having gotten nuclear working. So for example, Harazdan capacity factor is a term that says which fraction of your theoretical power output you can produce is only about, I estimate about 25%. And this makes lots of sense, okay? So again, we're going back to New England. This is our power curve. And we look, and you can also on the same website, you can see what are the resource, what's the energy mix? What do we get it from? How do we satisfy this demand over here? Nuclear is flat, so you're running nuclear at the maximum possible, okay? Because you're at that point you're only getting profit, okay? Fuel is cheap, you want to run it at the maximum. Gas is making up for the difference, plus we have hydro, which also making up for the difference. The reason we also do this is because gas is what's called a dispatchable power. You can modulate your gas output, energy output pretty quickly, within seconds. Hydro, more like a minute, but still you can catch up. Nuclear is difficult to modulate. The new plants you can sort of change their output better. So gas is a load follower. It can follow the demand. And old nuclear is not a load follower. So new nuclear is. Okay, I'm gonna try to skip a little bit ahead because I really want to leave some time for everyone else to also talk. So if you have two different reactors, okay, what are the things that are really important? We talked about capital costs and fuel costs. Fuel costs are going to be the same, okay? These things are the same. Ultimately, what really matters, what makes a difference, if you have decided you are going to get nuclear, what really matters to choose between two different nuclear reactor types is the ratio of capital cost to power. Okay? This is the levelized capital cost. And that's basically the financial metric with which you can sort of choose between different reactors, okay? So if you don't know whether to use nuclear or something else, what you are interested in is levelized cost of electricity. If you have decided that you need to use nuclear, then what you want is basically the cost per power of your reactor, okay? This is lots of numbers. I don't mean to overwhelm you, but what I want you to look at is this line. This is gas. And this one, advanced nuclear, is, well, nuclear, okay? And what you see here is the total system levelized cost of electricity. And this is based on very specific data set in the United States for the last 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. And you can see that when it comes to levelized cost of electricity, nuclear is twice more expensive than natural gas. And this explains why in America for the last 20 years, things have been going towards natural gas and not towards nuclear. But if we look at these two boxes, this tells you levelized capital cost. You see where this is coming from, right? You see that nuclear is about 6 times more expensive to build than natural gas. On the other hand, nuclear fuel is 3 times cheaper than natural gas. Okay. In the end, for better or for worse, natural gas wins. Of course, if you were to introduce like carbon tax, because natural gas is polluting, it's producing CO2, which is going to drive our planet, into a bad place in 100 years. You may say that actually this price is much higher because it should include the damages that CO2 is causing. Nuclear is not producing any CO2, right? Or very little anyway. Something that you'll need to see that offshore wind is quite expensive, okay? And solar is actually not so bad if you are looking at it, except that again, it's producing an electricity when we don't really need it. These are costs, remember, these are not the profits. What is really important when it comes to your determination, is not just the cost. Cost is only one part of the formula. What interests you is the profit, revenue minus cost. And that's what the profit is what determines, not cost. People tend to be laser focused on cost, but that's not really the right way of looking at this. And for solar revenues are very low. So solar profits and wind profits are very low as well. Okay, so why is nuclear so expensive? The number that I used in the past, it includes projects that had dramatic delays and cost overruns, okay? And one of the problems in the United States is that many of the reactors in the United States require customization by their utility companies. What this translates to is that we have this problem called first of a kind, basically reactor, where every time you build something as a first of a kind, it's always going to be more expensive because you're going to make many mistakes. Then if you have made a bunch of
excuse me for interrupting, but could you wrap it up? We're kind of way ahead in time, so.
Okay, so 5 more minutes, let's say.
Okay. Yeah, you've taken about 50, so.
Okay, I think we started at 1:20, so all right, okay. All right, so a few examples that I would say is that the Westinghouse, okay, so two stories, right? Like Westinghouse AP1000, which was built in Volta, Georgia, original price tag was $5 billion. The final price was almost $14 billion, so like 3 times higher, right? But there's also some positive developments too. So for example, Koreans built these APR 1400s in United Arab Emirates on budget, on time, and they were, they managed to get things done on time. So, but cost overruns is not a new thing. Let's skip this one. But basically, this is the history of the cost per unit energy, okay, of installed power. I'm sorry. This is in the 60s and up until the late 70s, the price was dropping. And after that, the price started going up. And this had to do with the fact that as reactors became big, they start running into a concept called these economies of scale. Everyone knows what's an economy of scale. As you make something bigger and more, you suppose things are becoming cheaper per unit. But in specific case of nuclear power, as you are making things bigger, okay, sometimes you start running into many problems. The system complexity drives the prices higher in an unexpected way. Okay, this is one thing that has made reactors more expensive, and that's one reason why everyone now wants to go to smaller sizes, like they used to be in the 60s. Okay, I'll skip some stuff over here. I'll just show this table. These are the numbers for a variety of reactors, both small and large. So this is the power 300 megawatt versus larger gigawatt reactors. Okay. And this is the cost per power. Just to make sure that I specify this, and Koroush corrected me, these are the costs overnight. These are costs without financing, okay? And you start seeing, okay, what the numbers are fairly large, okay? I mean, we're talking about $2 billion without financing, $2.5 billion. AP1000 end up being between $5,000 to $15,000. And new scale, okay, is about $10 billion, okay? It translates to a very expensive reactor, okay? Finally, one thing, maybe just 2 words about the Vivere 1200, because this is like hot topic in Armenia. Should Armenia adopt a Western design? Should it adopt Vivere 1200? Very briefly speaking, the problem with Vivere is that they are too powerful. Like we're talking about 1,200 megawatts, but average energy used in Armenia is 865 megawatts. basically, a nuclear power plant has 30% more power than what Armenia is consuming. Okay, what this translates that if you apply something like this, it's going to completely destabilize the system. Okay, the grid. I mean, there may be ways to run such a reactor. Okay, the reactor has some advantages. There's no doubt about that. Russians have very good experience building these reactors, and they have very attractive economic incentives to build, own, operate system that they are using. But you know, for as far as fitting such a big reactor in such a small grid, there is going to be some major technical problems. This is true for any large reactor, by the way, not just the Veritol foundry, which is why Armenia probably needs smaller reactors. Okay, summary. So, does Armenia need a new nuclear reactor? The answer is maybe. The devil is in the details. It has to be seen. Okay. The pros, as nuclear is a very energy dense source of power. It's good for energy independence. The cons, negatives, is that it's expensive. It's going to cost in $3 to $5 billion range. Likely there will be cost overruns, and economics of nuclear power is complex. Getting this part right is not easy. Okay. Past experience, we have seen that first of a kind reactors are difficult. Okay, and large reactors have been quite expensive. Okay, but not always. Okay. So anyone that comes to offers you a reactor, their offer needs to undergo a rigorous and strict peer review process. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Areg. I will save the questions till the end. I am getting already lots of questions in the chat. I would like to ask Bob Budnitz now to talk a little bit about the existing reactor in Armenia. So please, Bob. You're muted. You're muted, Bob.
Yes. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hi. I'm in Berkeley, California, just to introduce myself. This will be a short discussion about the current reactor in Armenia. I'll give you a little history and then talk about the current status and what I know about it. Way back in the early 70s, it was Soviet times, the USSR started to build reactors all over the USSR. And they started up two of them in Armenia. One of them, they started the construction in the early 70s. Unit 1 in Armenia, this is at Metsamor, began in 1976 and Unit 2 in 1980. At that time, those two reactors were, except for some special features having to do with seismic design, they were basically identical to about 24 reactors that they had built. Well, about a dozen of them they had built in the USSR, in Ukraine and in Russia mostly, but they built 24 others in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Bulgarians. They built 5 in Germany, East Germany. There were about 36 reactors, all identical, that they built at that time. And they started them in the 70s, and they were building them through the 80s. And those two in Armenia were among them. And they were more or less identical. When they started up in Armenia, the staff of those reactors was about half Armenian people and about half Russian people. But of course, in those days, there wasn't an Armenian country. They were all citizens of the USSR. I know you understand. And those reactors ran along from 1976 or 1980, the two units, until the Spitak earthquake in 1988. When the Spitak earthquake occurred in 1988, the two reactors were shut down by the Soviets. And the reason the USSR shut them down was that although there wasn't any damage to the reactors from the big earthquake, when they did an evaluation, they understood that had the Spitak earthquake occurred closer to the reactors, that the reactors could have gotten into serious trouble. So because of that, they shut them down and decided to do some studies and decide whether or not they could upgrade them and run them. And those studies went along for a couple of years. But as you know perfectly well, about 3 years later, the USSR collapsed. But during all that time, when those reactors were shut down, Armenia did not have trouble with electricity because it was part of a USSR Soviet-wide electric grid. Power, it was run by the Soviets. Power was imported from Georgia and from Azerbaijan and from Russia and from, they imported parts. It's a great big grid. But then the USSR collapsed. And around 1991, because of tensions, and you know perfectly well if most of you have Armenian heritage, perfectly well the troubles with NK and other troubles. They got cut off. They lost the two reactors in 1988, and they got cut off from the grid, from the Soviet grid around 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And there was a terrible period there. I was in Armenia during that period when there was only power for a few hours a day, and it was just a terrible period for the whole country. So Armenia embarked on a program itself, funded by itself, to restore the reactors and then to run them again. Now, in parallel with that, in 1991, and this is a very important thing for you to understand, in parallel with that, in 1991, the Western countries began to do analysis and understanding of all of those Soviet designed reactors. There were 36 of them. There were 24 of them in Eastern Europe, and then there were in Russia and Ukraine. And the Western countries did analysis and understood something that we hadn't really understood before, and that is that those reactors were very, very deficient in their safety, design, and operation and performance compared to reactors in the West. None of them could have met Western standards, none of them. So a program was put together by the Western countries under the World Bank's affiliate in London, under a World Bank program, in which a couple of $1 billion over most of a decade was put together to upgrade the safety of all of those reactors that the Soviets had built in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine. The Russians refused the money, but it also helped in Ukraine and in Lithuania and in Eastern Europe. And that program was known as the Nuclear Safety Account under the World Bank. And there was a steering committee that ran that $2 billion program. And there was an American, and the American was me, and a British and a French and a German and a Japanese and a Swede, and I was the American. And we ran that program for a whole lot of years, and we succeeded in upgrading all of those reactors with one exception. The US, sad to say, would not agree to upgrade the reactor in Armenia. This is 1991-23, because they were convinced that it was so old that it couldn't be upgraded properly. It turned out that except for 2 reactors in Russia, it is today the oldest reactor still running anywhere in the world. There's no other reactor as old as that. US decided they couldn't upgrade it. So the Armenians proceeded to upgrade it on their own. And by 1995, they were about ready to start because they desperately needed the power. And in 1995, the US relented and jumped into that program. And after that, the US was participating with the other countries in helping to upgrade the reactor. So in 1995, they started it up again. But because of troubles inside Armenia, the most important of which was staffing troubles, because of the brain drain that happened during that period, they couldn't staff both reactors. So they only started one of them. The other one, and they couldn't afford actually to do the upgrades they were doing on the other one too. So they only started one of them. It's Unit 2. The other one was abandoned and has been abandoned ever since. The other thing that they had to do in those intermediate years, those 4 years or so, was they had to stand up a regulatory agency to inspect and enforce regulations and so on, because the Soviet one was gone and they were a new country and they had to do that. By 1995, they had stood up a regulatory agency, the Armenian Nuclear Regulatory Authority. They had staffed enough to staff one reactor, and they started it up in 1995. In 1996, this is a very strange story. The president of Armenia, the new president of that time, he was Ter Petrosyan, had an interaction with a bunch of Russian engineers who said to them that they didn't need to continue upgrading the safety of that reactor because they were perfectly fine, because this, of course, was what the Russians were saying to themselves, which was wrong. But it's a typical Russian, it's sort of an insult to Mother Russia that the Western people would tell them that the reactor wasn't safe enough, but it wasn't. So the Russians were telling the president of Armenia that they didn't have to do any more safety upgrades, it was fine. He didn't believe him after he brought in Western people to tell him the opposite. So in 1996 and 7, the president of Armenia decided that he wanted to have an outside advisory committee to advise him about the safety of those reactors and to advise him about what continuing safety upgrades were necessary. So he established by decree something called the President of Armenia's Safety Council. And I was the American on that council from that day until today. which is, if you just think carefully, it's over a quarter century. I've been a member of that council. It met every year. We would go there for a week. We would do an evaluation. We would meet with the president and the prime minister, and we'd say this and this and this and this and this still needs to be done, and you got to pursue it. And you should know that over the intervening about the first 10 years, they succeeded in upgrading the safety of that reactor, so it met most Western standards, not all of them, but most Western standards. And over the next 10 years, they succeeded in doing the rest of the upgrades. So today, except for a few very, very difficult design features like the containment that they don't have, they've upgraded it so it pretty much meets Western standards. It's a nice thing to be able to say. And I was a member of that council from way, way back. But in 2017, they had a change from president to prime minister. You probably know about that political change in Armenia. And the council has not met since 2017. But only 2 weeks ago, I got an email from them saying they're going to reinstitute it. They're going to have another council meeting in the fall, and I'm going to go again. So I'm still in touch with that. So let me just go over the situation. Today, they're running one reactor. It's generating 400 something megawatts. It's a little over a third of the electricity in the country when you average it over a year, and they really need to run it. But it's very old, even though it's been upgraded to Western standards in many ways. It's very old. And the reason it's old is easy to explain. I want you to imagine that you had a 1975 Chevrolet. And years and years, and then finally you decided to upgrade it. Well, you can turn it into a brand new 1975 Chevrolet, but you can't turn it into a 2025 Chevrolet, right? You just can't, because certain design features are just different. And so this reactor is old. It's running. It's okay. It has low chance of having an accident, but it's old. So they do need to replace it. Now, there's some really important thing that happened just a few years ago, and that is in 2017, it's now a little over 6 years ago, they negotiated with the Russian counterparts a loan of $270 million, a loan of $270 million. Half of it was to be spent upgrading the energy output of that reactor from about 400 megawatts to about 450 megawatts. And the other half was going to be spent for safety upgrades. And that loan was to be paid off by having the extra electricity over 10 years. And they negotiated that loan, and it's now been 6 years into it, almost 7, and they're paying it off, and everything's fine. And they have both more electricity, and it's way safer because of that. And we should all thank the Russians for that, because they came up with that on their own. The other major players in this, all this time, have been the US, the British, the Germans, and the Czechs and the Slovaks have helped. Everybody should be thankful to them for all the help they did upgrading it. So let's talk about today. The reactor is running well. The staffing is excellent. They have excellent staff. I can tell you that personally. I mean, everybody that goes there says, gee, what wonderful engineers they have running that station. They're very competent. They meet Western standards. People admire them. And that's a really nice thing to be able to say. They also have a very strong regulatory agency, the Armenian Nuclear Regulatory Authority, which regulates and inspects, and they give them a license, and then they review things, and they're just as strong as they need to be, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to say that. So the situation is very good now, but that reactor isn't going to run for another 10 or 20 years. I mean, maybe it'll run for 10, but it's just old. And everything we're trying to do from the West to help them is keeping it, but it's old. So they do have to replace it. I just have one more positive thing to say, and then I'm done. I have full confidence myself, and I'm very in touch with the situation, that they have inside the country the full technical capability to design, to construct and operate a new reactor. I have no doubt about that. They have a good university system. They have these, I call them kids because, of course, at my age, they're my grandkids, the college kids coming through. And if they can keep them from the brain drain problem, they have full capability to run that new reactor technically with the strength and the competence that they need. They have a good safety culture. They have a lot of other things going for them. So I have confidence that they can pull that off. The only question that stands in the way is whether the economics will work. And that's not something I'm going to talk about, because it's not something that I that I'm an expert in. You just heard about it from Areg. And if you have any questions about that or the safety or whatever, I'm here to help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Shall we hear from Koroush, and then something about the newer, there is already a lot of discussion on fuel waste and so on. So please, Koroush, let's hear from you.
Oh, wait, I have one more sentence.
Yes.
Just to say, all the radioactive waste generated by that reactor in its whole lifetime, there were two, of course, at first, is still on the site. Safely managed, but it's on the site. I just ought to tell you that status. It's just one sentence. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll try to be brief given the time. So I was asked to talk about the status of small modular reactors, or SMRs for short. So right now, there is no expectation that we will have SMRs that do not use water as cooling this decade, or perhaps even this century, as far as a commercial operation and having a product that's commercially exportable to a place like Armenia. So the focus should be the water-cooled options. And these reactors range from 30 to 400 megawatt electric. As Areg showed, the electricity generation in Armenia is on the order of 865 megawatt electric. So these are the size of the reactors that probably fit within that grid. So of the water-cooled technologies, there are basically three types. One is a pressurized water reactor. This is the most common reactor type in the world. And they're coming at two different configurations. They're conventional configuration, similar to what you have right now in Armenia. And then there is another one called the integral configuration. This is the new scale from US, Neword from France, which have the original designer for it, as well as what KHMP from Korea is working on right now next. What's the difference between integral and conventional? In the integral one, you have basically the steam generator or the heat exchanger that takes the heat from the nuclear side and throws it on the turbine side to spin the turbine and generate electricity. They all are in one vessel. So they're all these components are all integrated in one vessel. So that's the main difference between them, and it shows up between the SMRs. There's also some SMRs are natural circulation, and right now today only the new scale SMR ends up being natural circulation. And the difference between that and your reactor operating right now a pump is pumping the water inside your core. In a new scale reactor, there's no pumps. Then there is a boiling water reactor design. There's really mainly one design of this kind right now being developed as a SMR. This is GE Hitachi, the BWRX 300. But it's worth mentioning because this is the project that is furthest along in North America as far as demonstration of these SMRs by 2029, likely 2030s. Now there's another type of a water-cooled reactor, which is the heavy water-cooled reactor. And India has a SMR, the 220 PHWR. They want to build, tens of these for themselves, but they're also looking at exports. But that's not going to be ready for now. But that's likely going to be, in terms of cost-wise, the cheapest option, because Indians right now today have the cheapest reactors, leveraging their indigenous supply chain. The Russians also have their own SMRs. Again, they still have small VBRs as well as their RITM, which they've also designed one for land-based. And then the Koreans, as I mentioned, they have this reactor called SMART, but it's really a national, national lab initiative. The commercial product right now is being developed by KHMP, but they don't expect it to be ready by 2030s. So these are some of the options. The rest of the options that are out there is it's shown in this graph, which is the UK SMR by Rolls-Royce. Again, they're targeting around early 2030s to be available for any type of export. Similarly, Neword, this is more like mid-2030s by French, available as integral design, as well as the CNNC, the Chinese. They're actually half finished building this reactor in China. So it's going to be ready for export in a few years. There's another US entity, Holtec, SMR 160. But this, back then in 2022, 2 years ago, all the US SMRs that were water-cooled were natural circulation. After a lot of talks with them and a lot of pushing, now we do have actually 2 of our reactors in the US. Today we have Westinghouse, which is at the AP300, which is a scaled down AP1000, as well as Holtec has actually changed their design from SMR 160 to SMR 300, and it's also forced circulation. So they're more in line with international designs. Internationally, there is not much experience with natural circulating reactors. So from a licensing point of view, they could meet some challenges when you're trying to look at new countries for exports. I think given there is only 8 minutes left for this whole symposium, I'll stop here, and we'll hand it back to you.
Yes. Thank you, Koroush. I had hoped that renewable reactors would be more ready by now. Also, Armenia could participate in some of the research that's going on with SMRs and perhaps reduce the cost that way. So before I completely open the panel for questions from the audience, we have some. I would just like to say that the past is not always a good predictor of the future. So money, natural gas costs, and the lowering prices are not necessarily what are predictors for the future. The accelerating climate change and the damage that goes along with it will be will also need to be taken into account. It cannot just be ignored as of today, and we're not talking about that at all. And there are some comments about solar power. Armenia does not have enough land if it was completely covered with solar panels to provide the electricity that it needs. And third, solar panels, those silicon panels have to be made in nuclear reactors. So that's something that people don't know. So I'd like to invite various people with their questions, and perhaps you can start commenting on that, Areg, with the economic aspect that natural gas pricing is not necessarily the issue.
Yes, what's the question? Sorry, can you repeat it?
No, I was just saying that the past is not a predictor of the future. So
Sure, no, absolutely.
say that
Yeah.
fracking provided cheap past is not necessarily a solution for the future. And
No,
that's something.
right.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that, yes, I'm not saying that this is the way in which things should be done, but I think this is the way in which they are done. And these are the realities that have driven. But basically, the purpose of the discussion of the levelized scope of electricity, natural gas prices, and things like that, is to explain why we don't have as many reactors as we do, and to understand that the economics of the reactors is extremely important. And for a country like Armenia too, it's going to be very important because we're talking about a reactor that may cost as much as $5 billion, and Armenia's GDP is $20 billion. So if you make a mistake, you will drive your economy bankrupt. It's something that has to be done very carefully, very optimally, while keeping in mind all the risks and all the benefits. I agree that Western countries that are the biggest polluters and emitters of CO2, they should take nuclear seriously as a way of displacing CO2, and by the way, also displacing coal ash from coal burning plants. I think in Armenia's case, I don't think Armenia should be in the business of saving the world. Also, Armenia is producing very little CO2. It's very, only 30% of its energy is natural gas to start with. So Armenia in that regard is actually is a very good performer. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. I would add, I think, to also reply to one of the questions on perhaps Western world helping Armenia. Through my interactions from White House all the way to Office of Clean Demonstration, Loan Office, their interface to World Bank, I don't see how U.S. gonna provide any type of special financing for a reactor in Armenia. We got other things going on. There's also other programs with other countries that have pretty much fully subscribed anything for the near future. However, countries like Korea and France continue to underbid in order to have nuclear construction projects, so they can eventually, service these projects. So they're willing to take that risk, and I don't see why they wouldn't do the same with a country like Armenia.
Yes, thank you, Al. Another question that comes up is always energy independence for Armenia. So perhaps, Koroush, you mentioned the type of fuels that are needed for this modular ones, and also Bob, for the regular type of nuclear reactors. In both cases, Armenia would be dependent on Russian sources of uranium. Is that correct?
No, it's not. Two things about the fuel. Several of the reactors in Middle Europe that are very similar to the Metsamor, designed in Soviet times and now being operated. I mean, they're the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Slovaks, the Bulgarians, so on. Several of them have either switched to Westinghouse fuel or are in the process of switching to Westinghouse fuel. And Westinghouse is now providing the fuel for the reactors in Ukraine because of the war that used to come from Russia. There's no doubt that in terms of supply, that Westinghouse, and there are a couple of other Western countries, could supply the fuel to Metsamor without a problem. In other words, competing with the Russians. It comes down to the cost, and then there are these political considerations. The second thing is the cost of the fuel. In a typical pressurized water reactor like theirs, the total cost of the fuel is a little less than 10% of the value of electricity. But the cost of the uranium is 2 or 3%. And the other 6 or 7% is the cost of enriching it and then fabricating the fuel, which is a very high-tech and very costly process. So the cost of the uranium itself is only 2 or 3%. If the world market for uranium were to double, Metsamor would have to pay another 2 or 3% for the raw uranium. It's not the uranium, but it's the fabrication of fuel. But even the fuel as fabricated is a little less than 10%. So I don't think that the fuel cost is going to be a big deal, even if it went up a little. You shouldn't think that should stand in the way if they're going to go with a light water reactor. Okay.
What were we talking about in terms of a light water reactor?
Well, there's another.
It was in your tables. I don't remember it.
Well, and Annie, there's another consideration which I want to be sure to say. When I talked about 10 or 15 minutes ago about the reactor getting old, I'm not really concerned that the probability of getting into a serious accident is going to get worse. I mean, there's going to be some degradation over the years as it gets old, but I believe that can be managed by sensible programs of just managing it right. The problem is that the reliability of some of the equipment that doesn't have to do with the nuclear safety may get in trouble, and the reactor may have low availability. That is, it isn't going to run, but it's not because of nuclear safety. It's because of the reliability and the operability of some of the other equipment. So if that reactor is going to get to 2050, I've just made that up, but whatever, it's going to be because they have addressed those other non-nuclear problems. I don't think that the getting to 2040 or 50 is a problem in terms of nuclear reactor safety. It's because of those other reliability issues that very old machines face.
Yes. So you had an approximate number, Areg, for a standard type of reactor cost in your tables?
I had some estimates of the construction costs, overnight costs, that I had. Are you referring to the table that I showed earlier?
Yes.
Yeah, so the table is very much U.S. centric. Now in Armenia, the whatever that's going to get constructed depends on the any type of agreements of how much of the reactor or how much of its components or labor will be done in Armenia, and how would you procure all these materials. But yeah, in general, the Koreans, Chinese, Indians, their costs tend to be lower. On the Korean side is mainly just underbidding. They can absorb losses. They don't have a problem. The whole thing is nationalized program. And in case of the Chinese and Indian, their supply chain is just the costs are much lower than the alternative countries.
Yes, and there are questions about how the uranium would come, how the fuel would come to Armenia. And I just have a question, and I don't know if anyone in the audience knows. Armenia did have uranium mining, but I believe all the uranium goes out of Armenia to be processed. Does anyone know about that?
Yes, there's no capability to manufacture a reactor fuel in Armenia. And it's almost inconceivable that they would develop something like that.
Yeah.
There are a few suppliers worldwide, and they would just almost surely have to go with one of them. There's the Russians, and of course Westinghouse, and the Germans and the Japanese.
Yeah, the most of fuel, I mean, Koroush can talk about this much more than I can, but the fuel production is limited to just a few countries. As Bob said, the actual ore, the cost of the ore that comes out from the ground, for example, in Armenia, is only 2% of the total final cost of the fuel. So the fact that your country has uranium, everyone has uranium. Like any country, you can get uranium out of seawater. Abundance of uranium, that doesn't change anything. However, the capability to turn that, what comes out from the dirt, into nuclear fuel that goes to a reactor, that capability is quite limited to a few countries. And Armenia will never be allowed to develop such a capacity for a variety of proliferation-related reasons. If you want to know why, then look at Iran.
By the way, there's another consideration that I know the Armenians surely are thinking about, because everybody is thinking about, and that is the promise of the small reactors being having a lower cost depends on factory fabrication of a good deal of it, and that depends on having multiple orders rather than just one order. So that let's pretend, I'm just going to pretend, I'm making this up, that some country, I'm going to call it Poland, just because I don't know. Suppose Poland orders 10 of them from GE. I just made that up because they're not about, right? Then Armenia could order the 11th one, okay? And then they could take advantage of an economies of production that they couldn't if they just ordered one from GE. Or by the way, it could be Siemens, or it could be the Koreans. I just made that up as an example. But if the Armenians are going to order one reactor and piggyback it on a big order of identical ones from elsewhere, then some of those economies of manufacturing production can be realized in a way they wouldn't be if they ordered just one from someplace without that other thing. So what that means is the Armenians are surely unlikely, just for economics, to go first. But if they wait, and we see which of these designers gets orders that actually fill their order book, then the Armenians can take advantage of that. And we don't know, and none of us knows. Anybody thinks they know is just that isn't so. Nobody knows.
But Bob, I would partially let's say caution that statement, because that depends on actually having large orders. And so at that point, Armenia will have to wait, decades. And as we heard, there's going to be an energy crisis. So
Sure.
I think going with something that is more firm is a much,
Yeah, it's a dilemma.
Maybe
we all agree it's a dilemma.
Yes, I see a hand by Sosi. Please unmute.
Thank you very much. This is extremely informative and interesting. This has been the construction of nuclear power plant, the new one, has been kind of my obsession for more than 20 years. I've even written a book about it, but I know very little about its technical or economic aspects. My book was, I'm a political scientist, international relations expert. So my book that was published by NATO Defense College in 2008 tackles those issues with very shallow, superficial overview of technical aspects. And I have few questions since I have found you experts of those technical aspects in one place about technical aspects. The first is one of you mentioned the spent nuclear waste is basically kept in dry storage in Metsamor that has been built by Framatome, France, like many, many years ago. And I was always told that it's out of capacity a long time ago, and Georgia doesn't allow to transport it to Russia, where it was recycled years ago during the Soviet period. So one of my questions is how to resolve this issue. The second, what Ani just asked about fuel, because apparently we're receiving uranium from Russia, and I'm strongly convinced we cannot do it in Armenia because of political and technical reasons, because of a safeguards agreement, etc. And as far as I know, we don't really have this much uranium because it's very limited and it's very deep, it's very difficult to exploit. So okay, let's say some Western country will send us fuel. So here again, there are a lot of political issues because Georgia may not be excited about transporting it through its territory. Iran is not an option for any Western country. Only India can do it. And Turkey may not allow to transport it by air over its airspace. So, and my third question is, can we keep Metsamor, but buy a reactor, like a medium-sized reactor, and put it in the same space? Because if we build a new one in a different area, again, we are going to face huge problems, because you may know that now Azerbaijan is literally shelling any factory that we are trying to build in Armenia. Even American joint venture was shelled in our border region, Yerazk, and they had to move it elsewhere. So there are a lot of questions like this. Sorry for too many questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Sosi. Who would like to tackle which one? So the travels, I think, through airspace, no one's going to give us any. We're going to have to buy some, and the travel can be worked out. But yes, so any of the other questions?
Yeah, if I can quickly answer that, because I have to leave, unfortunately, 2 minutes. I have to drive my son to the airport. So Armenia is regularly receiving uranium from Russia. I mean, regularly, as in every 2 years. I think it got fuel, if I'm not mistaken, last year as well. I believe it's going through Georgia, if I'm not mistaken. So whatever new fuel we get from a new source will follow the same pathway, I think. As far as the spent fuel is concerned, also, if I'm not mistaken, 2007 or 2010, Russia stopped receiving the fuel back. It would always take the fuel back, and it stopped doing it. Not because Georgia would not allow it, but from what I understand, Russian different environmental groups started protesting it. That's what I've heard. I may be wrong. But as far as the storage of the spent fuel is concerned, the amount of fuel that we're talking about, as I mentioned, is very little, right? Like you are running 2 years, and then the amount of fuel that you end up producing is something like few cubic meters. It's like all the fuel that has been produced, that has been burned in Metsamor over the last 20 years, it can almost fit in this room where I'm sitting. It's like not, I mean, it takes more space because every fuel element goes into separate concrete dry cask, but it's not as much as it is. Typically, most likely, if Armenia signs a contract with a different country, that country, if it provides the fuel, it will have to also take the fuel back. And but that's primarily a reflection of proliferation concerns, that they don't want Armenia to keep spent fuel for all variety of reasons. And with that, I'm going to thank everyone, and I have to leave, unfortunately. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues for interesting talks they gave. And
Right, thank you, Areg. And I believe Koroush also had to sign off, so thank you both very much. I see Ara Marjanian has a hand up.
Thank you, everyone, for this interesting conversation. I'm Ara Marjanian from Armenia. I'm power engineer and a senior analyst from the bunch of think tanks. I have a request, actually, not a question. Can we organize more specific meetings on our ARPA platform dedicated to the specific engineering problems of the new nuclear power plant? Because I think that we miss a very important pressing issue. It is not a matter of desire to have a new nuclear power plant. It is the requirement of Armenian energy strategy document, which says that Armenia should have nuclear power generation uninterrupted. That means that even if we prolong 10 more years of the operation of reactor number 2 on Metsamor till 2036, we now create a gap between 2036 and some years when Armenia most probably would lose its power generation. It becomes direct violation of the concept of Armenian energy strategy. Second issue, which I find very important, is the issue of green labeling of nuclear power. I think it is important for Armenia to proceed with these activities and name nuclear power as green power, as did our European colleagues, all 27 of them. If we succeed in this, then we can apply for cheap investment money for nuclear-related projects. Third issue, which I find very important, is the high voltage grid connection of Armenia to its neighbors, firstly to Iran and then to Georgia. If we succeed with this robust high voltage connection with our neighbors, then the questions of limitation of new power reactor in Armenia will become less important. We can easily absorb more than 1,000 megawatt of new nuclear reactor. And the fourth issue, which I should...
Yes.
Yeah, and fourth issue, which I request to discuss more specifically, is the question with these small power reactors. We all knew the difficulties in USA with this new scale development. The company just stopped their development of these new small power reactors. For Armenia, small power reactors is not a perspective issue. Armenia is not an icebreaker, not a nuclear submarine. It could not base its economy on small power reactors. I request ARPA and distinguished guests to be more specific on these issues in maybe future meetings. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Ara. I think the discussion is worldwide because nuclear, even the Green Party has recognized that nuclear is green in the sense of limited CO2 emissions or very low CO2 emissions. Yes, I was going to invite Astrine Pashoyan to speak since she works for ESF in Armenia. Please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I would like to second Dr. Marjanian's opinion that we would really like to continue this discussion. It's a pressing topic. It is complicated because of the political rationale. And let's not forget that how much nuclear energy, the fact, absolutely nuclear has no alternative. It's in our strategy. And as Dr. Danagoulian mentioned, it's an economic issue. The all the possible ways you model the future of Armenia without nuclear, it is destabilized. So there's no option at this stage. No matter how much we invest in solar, we don't want to repeat the German mistake of green transition when you're unprepared to supply your base load with some stationary 24/7, 12 months a year electricity supply. And for us, it's either nuclear or we're going to have to build modular gas-fired cogeneration, those gas turbine plants, which have a higher fuel cost and extend the energy security threats because they create a more imminent threat. If you recharge your nuclear station with fuel every 2 years, gas needs to flow permanently. We only have like 200 days worth of storage. So these are national security. It's not even energy security. These are national security threats. However, the cost of making a mistake in your technology selection driven by political selection, which supply you want to go with, meaning that's a political marriage of your nuclear power plant to a particular vendor of not only the technology, but usually also the fuel. Russian reactor goes with Russian fuel, Canadian reactor with Canadian fuel, right? We need to understand that. A lot of complexities come from that, but that mistake of, $4.6 billion that is estimated for a new Russian reactor, not only it's a humongous reactor that we don't have consumption for, it's nearly half of the GDP. You make that mistake, the debt hole you're going to get in can only be mitigated if you can export electricity. We are going to have surplus electricity generated. And if we cannot export it and get integrated into regional electricity networks, that surplus electricity is going to kill every work we've done on renewables for the past 20 years. It's going to kill every other domestic production that we've, even the small hydro, even the, the solar and the potential for wind. It will just create this artificial parasite that creates artificially cheap electricity that you cannot reject. You will just need to consume it. And the ability of Iran to take that in a barter trade is quite limited because they're building their own nuclears very close to the, in their own country. So Iran's deficit, and that has driven the gas to electricity barter trade, is gradually going to diminish. So it's this question has too many sides to be just viewed as, what is the reactor, what is the cost? It's a market issue, it's a political issue, and a geopolitical threat. I agree with Ms. Tatikian that we need to really understand, the war ramifications. One of the reasons why we should have a nuclear power plant, as far as I'm concerned. But thank you so much, and I second Dr. Marjanian's request. Let's keep this talk open.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. Germany has basically sold its soul because they have shut down their nuclear plants, and now their backup to the renewable solution is coal. And because of that coal and the natural gas with Azerbaijan, I mean, it's riding their politics. You may have
one
heard
of the reasons for Ukraine war. If you really look into it, that's one of the reasons, if not the main reason, for the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, an activity regarding a book was canceled in Berlin just because Azerbaijan objected, for example. It's a hugely geopolitical. The nuclear energy for Armenia is both independence, but as you mentioned, Astrine and Dr. Marjanian, it's really tied to whoever you make a choice to go on with. Thank you very much, all of you. Mr. Panosian, there's been a lot of good questions. Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to the panelists, as well as especially the moderator. This was an excellent discussion, I think. And yes, we will try to have a follow-on maybe in the near future sometime and discuss more details. And as far as geopolitical challenges that Armenia faces, we have our next panel discussion will be related to that. The title will be Armenia in the South Caucasus, Geopolitical Challenges and Opportunities over the Coming Decade. And there are quite a few experts, international experts that we have invited, and there will be a white paper that will also be available to everybody that explains all the details. So we will send you the invitations in the near future. And once again, if you like what ARPA Institute is doing, please be generously donating to our cause. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you again next time.
And thanks to all of you who attended, and thank you, Hagop, for making this possible.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.